everyone, Dr. Jason Old here, surfer, historian, world traveler, and your host of the Surfing Historian podcast. This season, we'll be diving deeper into the nuanced world of surfing and examining the historical, cultural, philosophical, and even scientific elements of the sport we're all stoked on. So let's paddle out together and ride through the world of academia. This episode is sponsored by Face Stuff. Face Stuff's an all-natural zinc-based product company from San Diego, California that uses ingredients that are safe for the ocean while also protecting and moisturizing your skin. So instead of soaking up nasty radiation like chemical sunscreens, Face Stuff helps your skin reflect it. I'm a big fan of Face Stuff and always have a canister on hand and ready to use. Check them out at face-stuff.com and use promo code STOKED15 for 15% off their incredible products. Joining me today is journalist and novelist Michael Scott Moore. Michael's the author of a travel book about surfing that he titled Sweetness and Blood: How Surfing Spread from Hawaii and California to the Rest of the World, with some unexpected results. A book that was in fact revered as one of the best books of 2010 by The Economist. Sweetness and Blood, by the way, is also featured on surfinghistorian.com. Shortly after the publication of this intriguing book, Michael was kidnapped in early 2012 on a reporting trip to Somalia and held hostage by pirates for 32 months. He wrote a memoir about this experience that became an international bestseller. That book's titled The Desert and the Sea: 977 Days Captive on the Somali Pirate Coast. For today's episode, we'll focus primarily on his surfing history, Sweetness and Blood. However, we'll also make time to chat about his harrowing experience as a hostage in Africa as well. I'm super stoked to have you on to share these stories with our listeners. I'm also looking forward to picking your brain about some of these surf destinations you wrote about in Sweetness and Blood, some of which I've personally surfed, others I'm interested in visiting in the near future. But before we get started, I want to personally thank you, Michael, as well as our listeners, for being part of this episode of The Surfing Historian.
Thanks for having me, Jason. This is terrific.
Hey, Michael, thanks so much. The pleasure is mine, to be honest. I'm really grateful you've, taken the time to come on. And I just want to get right into Sweetness and Blood. I enjoyed the book. It's on surfinghistorian.com. And, I recommend it obviously to the listeners. Go check it out. And I think one of the things I really liked most about it was you talk about a lot of places that are, a lot of them aren't high profile surf spots. And so I just want to go ahead and get into this. And I'm just curious to know what compelled you to write this book and even what compelled you to go to some of these places.
Well, I tried to put a mix of countries on the list because I didn't want to write about all the countries that people knew about or that surfers knew about, but also some places where even surfers might be surprised to learn that there was a surf scene. It actually started with Germany. So I don't think I would have written the book if I had not moved from California to Berlin in about 2005 or so. I started the book in 2007, and one spur for it was learning that there was a surf scene in Germany at all. And since I'm from Redondo Beach, which is where supposedly the first surfer in North America first landed in 1908, that was George Freeth from Hawaii. I thought, well, who was the first surfer in Germany? And that was a fruitful question. So that was a fertile question. And it turned out to be a really interesting answer. And from there, I had already been to Indonesia. I had lots of material from Indonesia. The surf history there turned out to be really interesting. Otherwise, that's a typical, surf destination, at least for Australians. And then I made a list of other places that were both a little bit unlikely, but also had a really good origin story. So that origin story was important. And the origin story was not necessarily the real first surfer. So I tried to find both if I could, but there was always a mythical first surfer, and that was George Freeth in California. There were probably other actual Hawaiian princes who surfed in Santa Cruz before Freeth, in fact, before the 20th century. There were always sort of bifurcated stories like that in almost every country I went to. But the mission on the book was to find the first surfer mythically and then historically, if possible.
That's, I it's interesting you bring up Freeth and with California. And, I interviewed a buddy, Patrick Moser, about his book.
Oh, yeah.
And we talk a little bit about that as well, where it's, everybody kind of attributes the first surfer to George Freeth. And as you said, there were some Hawaiian princes that were, I think, at a military academy or something, and they were surfing
In Northern California, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's, super interesting the way you frame it. It's like there's the mythical first surfer, and then there's the actual first surfer. And, in doing my research in Nicaragua, I sort of stumbled upon that as well. Like, a lot of myth or a lot of stories. And then there's, sort of the actual first documented surfers. So,
Exactly.
I guess that's somewhat ubiquitous around the world. And so I want to go ahead and start with Germany, actually, because you said that's really what inspired you to write about this, or your time in Berlin.
Yeah.
So who are the first mythical surfers and who are the first real surfers in Germany? Because, there's really, and to my knowledge, it's really just, kind of river surfing. So, help me unpack some of these myths and inform the listeners on German surf culture.
Right, so that's wrong. It's not just river surfing, but that's the first thing I heard about. I was in Berlin for not very long before somebody told me, "Oh, well, there's a river in Munich where they surf." I'm like, "I've lived in Munich. How do I not know that?" And so I went down there to inspect that first, and I wrote a couple of articles about that. I wrote one article for the Atlantic Monthly, and that kind of led to the book, as a matter of fact, because I learned there that the little culture of surfing on the river in Munich was not the only bit of German territory that had surfers on it. And in fact, surf history in Germany goes back a long way, to the 1950s, longer than you would expect for such a strange country. And the first man to surf was almost certainly Uwe Drath. That's a good northern name. He was a lifeguard on the island of Sylt, which is near Denmark, all the way up at the top of Germany. And in the 1950s, the lifeguards got these big rescue boards, which they were not supposed to stand up on. But Uwe Drath, being an independent-minded man, had seen pictures of Hawaiians in an encyclopedia. And he thought that was just marvelous, the idea that people could stand up in the waves. And so he tried to do it, and he did it. And I forget which year. In fact, I don't think the year was entirely clear. It was probably around 1954. But a lot of kids, there were obviously a lot of grommets around even then, who were just fascinated by this guy who could stand up in the waves up in northern Germany. And so all these 12-year-olds would go out and watch this lifeguard sort of ride his board upright. And all those guys, all those grommets, grew up to become the surf scene in Sylt. And I met them. I mean, I went up there and I talked to Uwe. He was still alive at that point, kind of a vigorous German 80-odd-year-old. And all the guys who were younger than him were basically the fathers of German surfing. Now, you have to say that the waves in Sylt are not very good. The wind is much better. So it blows really hard, but the waves are pretty small. And as a result, windsurfing developed a little bit more vigorously in Sylt than wave surfing. And so now when people go to Germany, they realize that there are a lot of windsurfers. And that stems directly from Sylt and the conditions on Sylt. And then, of course, the fact that Germany has lots of lakes. But you have to say, it also didn't just go to West Germany. From Sylt, it spread all the way down to East Germany as well as West Germany. So you had a windsurfing culture on both sides of the Iron Curtain.
Wow, that would be an interesting Cold War history to look at. I guess in a sense, I mean, you just kind of, you sort of elaborate on a little bit, but that would be a fascinating Cold War history of, windsurfing.
Well, and it was. I told the story of two guys who in the 1980s set sail from East Germany on their on their sailboards, and they landed on the Danish island of Møn. They actually spent a night crossing that channel, and one of them I think got cut off by a Soviet freighter, so it was not an easy crossing. But they landed on the Danish island of Møn and basically defected from East Germany. They had to go back down to West Germany to claim some rights. But the first thing one of them saw when he landed in Denmark was a sign that said no windsurfing.
I think that was probably the least of his worries at that point.
No, but he arrives in the free West, right?
Yeah, exactly. That is somewhat ironic.
From East Germany, and he sees a sign that says he's not allowed to windsurf.
Wow, that's and that as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, and even in the book itself, you go to these unique places, and as we've already said, they're not high profile. You do, of course, go to, some places that are a little bit more well known, but
yeah.
I guess my question is, sort of as we move through these chapters, what can historians learn from this? How can we learn about, let's say, the Cold War or history through this book? Because your book really is, in my view, a surfing history as well, not just a surf travel book.
Yeah, so that has to be qualified. It's a history of surfing, but it's a history of modern surfing. And the spread of modern surfing is absolutely associated with the spread of American influence and the spread and the changes during the Cold War. And that's really important to say, because of course lots of people everywhere have developed surf cultures, and that's become more clear in the last few years. The book Afro Surf has some really good examples of it. But the main trunk of modern surfing is surfing in Hawaii and Polynesia, which is important to talk about too. But and then how it arrived in America, and then how it became something new, just like the blues became something new and electric in rock and roll in America, and then spread out all over the world. I think there's an actual parallel to be made between modern surfing and what became rock and roll too, because America became an empire, especially after World War II. It started to do that beforehand, but after World War II, like all empires, it absorbed these cultures from other parts of the world, and then it changed them. And that's really what the book is about. And that's one meaning for the title too. The title is Sweetness and Blood, because the legacy is also bifurcated. The legacy is not entirely good, just like the legacy of American influence around the world, but it's also not entirely bad. And what a lot of people received from this notion of this notion that you could surf at all, right, was an idea of freedom, and that is something that America exported without quite realizing it. I'm not so sure Americans realize that we've had such a huge influence in spreading surfing around the world. When we think of American sports, we think of baseball. And comparatively, almost no one plays baseball around the world. So our official idea of ourselves is not quite what really moved around the world.
Yeah, no, and it's a great point. And the connection between surfing and rock and roll. One of the next episodes is with Tim Cooley, who wrote Surfing About Music.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, so I'm super stoked to get him on and chat about that connection, like you said.
Yeah.
And another person I've had on before who's a great friend is Scott Latterman, who's written, precisely about what you said, that sort of connection between the proliferation of surfing and American empire. And absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, and just as sort of a random side note, I just published an article about the three most popular sports in Nicaragua, one of which being the number one sport, baseball. And that all of those places we talk about in the Caribbean basin that are popular, where baseball's essentially number one, is a direct result of American imperialism,
Yeah, no question.
American occupation. So yeah, I
Exactly.
mean, I think you're spot on. One of the things you mentioned, and I'm going to try to get past Germany, even though I find everything you were saying fascinating. But
Uh-huh.
one of the things I found really interesting was you said that the Germans saw, I think in an encyclopedia or almanac, saw Hawaiian surfing. So surfing wasn't introduced to Germany by, say, Americans.
Yeah, that's another reason it was good to have Germany on the list. I mean, it didn't just happen because I was living there, but it was interesting to include because it was an exception to the kind of common rule that I was finding. I don't want to be monolithic about any of my ideas, so I wanted to show an exception to. I mean, of course, when it was spreading around the world in the 50s and 60s, people were not thinking, oh, this is this new American thing. Everyone knew that it came from Hawaii, but it had become something new and accessible, especially with fiberglass boards. And Uwe Drath really developed it, in his corner of Germany without thinking about American influence. I mean, he was living in actually British occupied Germany, but after the war, but the American influence was all around him. But he's an exception to the idea that the Americans brought it to so many places.
Yeah, it's super fascinating, and I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't even think about that. And so another place you talk about, I'm kind of going to jump all over the place with the chapters, but another place you talk about is the UK in Cornwall, I believe.
Mhm.
And just to put kind of a shameless plug out there, we have a number of nonprofits on surfinghistorian.com that those of you who are listening and you want to not just surf but do more than surf, check that out and get involved with some of those awesome nonprofits there. But
Mhm.
Michael, but as far as your chapter, what are some of again, this to me, the UK is not a high profile surf destination by any means, but what were some of the places you visited, and in terms of the history of surfing there, how long had that been? Had it been since, mid-century, or was it fairly new?
Since the 1930s. I mean, it's incredible. Uwe Drath was made. I couldn't find an absolute answer to this, but he was maybe the first surfer on the continent of Europe. I think he surfed a little bit before um, Zanuck in France. But if so, it was by a year, or two. But in the 1930s, there were people in Cornwall surfing on Tom Blake style surfboards, and that one of those Tom Blake style boards, they were practically boats, hollow boats, is hanging on the wall of a British pub down in Newquay, or at least down in Cornwall, and I thought that was fascinating. So I went to England partly because the history there was so interesting. I would have gone to Ireland because I think the waves are better, but I decided to stick with England, partly because there was communication back then in the 30s with Duke Kahanamoku, so there was some direct influence from Duke in the east of England, and
Wow, I
also,
didn't realize that.
yeah, I think that's how they wound up with a Tom Blake board. I think Duke facilitated that, and then because England was so susceptible to the hippie movement, in the 1960s, surfers. I mean, Brits were interested in all kinds of things, and one of the things that happened in Cornwall was this development of a sort of hippie style surf movement, and the first British surf company was called Bilbo Surfboards, and that is no accident that it's named after Bilbo Baggins.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, I again, like we said, with the connection between surfing and rock and roll, and the hippie movement, is that I learned so much from your book, because when I think of that sort of the bushy blonde hair, of the like the Beach Boys music, I'm thinking California, Southern California specifically,
Right.
but I never thought to think about England, but obviously there was a robust rock and roll with the Beatles, and we could rattle off all sorts of names. But yeah, I never thought to connect that surfing culture there with the music as well. So yeah, it's just, again, you're taking that journey with you through England. I was like, okay, that, I didn't think about that, again,
Yeah.
because these are lesser known places, and you really kind of bring to light these really amazing stories.
Yeah, that was the fun part of the book, about the book. So
I'm gonna move away from Europe now. We're gonna head to Morocco, and
yeah.
I was super stoked when I saw that as a chapter, because I've surfed Morocco, but
Mhm.
and I think in the book you called it, I don't know if it was something you called it or it's been called this, but the California of Islam.
Yes.
And
Uh-huh.
I can see that. But again, let's just look at how did surfing start in Morocco? And like I said, I have a number of really, really good Moroccan surf buddies now. And as you probably well know, post publication, Morocco has become a huge surf destination.
Yeah, and I was there right when it was becoming that. So it's been a surf destination for a long time. It was also on the hippie trail. But surfing started there as a direct result, again, of American imperialism. So the two countries I went to introduced had surfing introduced, not maybe not by American Marines, but with the help of American Marines who were stationed there because of World War II. So the Allies invaded North Africa, almost as practice for D-Day, in about a year before D-Day, I think in 1943. And we wound up with a Marine station at Media Plage, which is in northern Morocco, and at Port Liotti, I think it's called. And two young Moroccan guys, an ethnic Moroccan and a young French teenager, saw a Marine on a surfboard near the base. The base happened to have pretty good surf, and these two guys saw him and decided they wanted to try it too. One was Mamoun Kabour, and he was a lifeguard at the time in Morocco, and his friend Pierre Chalot. Chalot thinks it was 1957, 58, or 59. They saw a Marine walking on water, is how he phrased it, right? He thought that was wonderful. And Chalot convinced a relative of his to send him down a surfboard from Osagor in France, where they were available. And so Mamoun and Pierre Chalot became the first surfers in Morocco. That's documentable. But then the rest of the history of surfing, modern surfing in Morocco, is hippies going down there with their fiberglass boards and then leaving them behind. And normally Moroccan kids are too poor to buy a surfboard, but when a hippie left a board behind, then he could start a sort of local surf culture, and that tends to be what happened there.
Yeah, it's again, the way sport, or in our case surfing, which is what we're talking about, obviously the way it spread through militarism is fascinating.
Yeah.
Again, like I said, Scott Latterman talks about, you talk about it. I had someone early on in this season, Steve Estes, a friend of mine, that we look at surfing in the South and how surf culture and the US South, how it grew because of essentially people being placed, in these bases around throughout the South, and we're surfers.
I heard that. I thought that was fascinating, and and it's true, in the rest of the world too. I think the way I phrase it in Sweetness and Blood is that in at least a few places, surfing arrived by American force of arms.
Yeah.
That's for the title. Sweetness and Blood sort of expresses that, right?
No, I think the title's, an incredible title. It's really what drew me to the book. I'm like, all right, let's see what this is about. And I was obviously pleased with, for what it's worth. I know that I mentioned in the intro that it was the Economist put it as, I think in 2010, as like a best book of the year. So
Yeah,
congrats on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I do have a question for you though, because you were mentioning this hippie trail, and I would imagine most listeners kind of can gather what that might be about, but specifically, what is the hippie trail, and where does it start, where does it end, and Because obviously, as you said, it's was instrumental in getting introducing more people to surfing in a sense.
Yeah, and more importantly, it was, that era after World War II saw a lot of young people just wanting to know more about the rest of the world and feeling very tired with their own cultures. So hippies went out to learn new stuff, and they typically went to Eastern oriented places, and so Morocco, being the California of Islam, was the westernmost frontier of Islam as a rule. It's Sufi, which means it's more open-minded, and the other country that qualifies as the California of Islam would be on the other extreme of the Muslim world, which is Indonesia, all the way in the east, also Sufi. Both places were on the hippie trail. So hippies would go to both places, as well as, of course, Iran, Afghanistan, India. India is the sort of classic destination, but all these other places, which are now closed by war or other horrors, were open to hippies in VW buses, and so they spread out, and there were a few sort of beaten paths, and Morocco was on one of them.
Yeah, it's you bring up a really important point about just history in general and how things change. Like you said, this was part of your, as you called it, the hippie trail, and now they're pretty much off limits because of conflict or all sorts of reasons. And it's interesting to see how that's changed. But yeah, as you said, Morocco, in my experience as well, seemed to be more, for lack of a better term, more open, more mellow. I think you said Sufi, that was the word you used.
Yeah.
But where did you go specifically in Morocco? Did you? Oh, and I guess Mike, seems like an obvious question, but did you surf as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I went 2 or 3 times to Morocco, and yeah, absolutely, I went surfing. So first of all, I have to say it's not just Sufism and sort of an openness as opposed to a hardline Islam. It's also Kif is really available in Morocco, so you can go down there and find marijuana. That drew hippies too. One of the Brits I talked to, a shaper called Chris Jones, he had remembered going to Tagazout when he was a kid, maybe in the 70s rather than the 60s, but he was obviously an ex-hippie. And so a lot of Brits went down there. And I went to Tagazout first, which is a fishing village. I also went to Imswan. I think you mentioned surfing at Imswan. I think Ualidia too, and Essaouira, but there wasn't much surfing there.
Yeah, that's a windsurfing spot for sure.
Yeah, it's a windsurfing spot. Exactly.
And you were there in 2000, well,
2007 and 8.
Yeah. And I was there in 2016, 17, something like that. And it's, Tagasud, Agadir, that whole area is just, I've seen it really grow, and over the years. So it was interesting to read when, reading your book, just seeing how it's turned into this, well-known surf destination.
Yeah.
I'm trying to stay within the continents the best I can with your chapters, and I know I'm bouncing around, but you also went to Sao Tome, and
yeah.
I guess another shameless plug. I had sort of learned about the surfing culture there through, as I was perusing the world to put nonprofits on surfinghistorian.com for people to find, and I found some people doing really incredible work in Sao Tome, and I was just completely unfamiliar with it. So what was it like to go there? And, in terms of surf culture, what was, give us a little bit of a rundown on your experience there.
Well, Sao Tome was fascinating because it was the site of what was supposedly, according to Sam George, who went there in 2000, who went there a few years before I did. Sam George is a surfer here in California who's written for Surfer Magazine. And, I grew up knowing his byline and Surfer and stuff like that. So he did a film about going to Sao Tome in about 2007. And he thinks that he reintroduced the kids there to stand-up surfing. But what he says accurately is that they went there looking for surf, and they found an existing surf culture, because kids have been bodyboarding there on pieces of their father's fishing canoes for generations, if not centuries. And that kind of local surf culture, especially centered around fishing communities, is and probably is common up and down the African coast. He points this out too. The earliest mentions of surfing in Africa are in Ghana. One of them even predates. If it's really a description of a surf community, it's hard to say. But obviously, the parents wanted the kids to learn to swim in the ocean, and so they had a kind of a hard way of training their kids, and that gets described in 1640, I think, and that's in Afro surf. That was just sort of dug up by a scholar here in California 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, you talking about Kevin Dawson's book?
Dawson, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Kevin. Yeah, he was on a few episodes back, and yeah, he is really again, like your book and like many others. It opened my eyes to a world I wasn't even thinking about. And yeah, he talks about, as you just said, the sort of this legacy of wave riding in places like Ghana and the western coast of Africa, and so yeah. Sao Tome fits right in there, I would imagine.
It really does. And as Sam said, he's been surfing in Ghana too, and he couldn't find anyone who was surfing. But there's another really clear description of people bodyboarding exactly like they were in Sao Tome, exactly like they do in Sao Tome. And so Sam said very, pointedly, the question is, why did it disappear? Where did it go? And the answer is that these things change. Customs grow and disappear and that kind of thing. But he found a fishing village called Porto Alegre on the south end of the island. Sao Tome and Principe are twin islands in a single nation that belong to a longer archipelago, not far from Nigeria, in that bite off Nigeria. And Sam went there, and I think went to a smaller island where they've now built a resort. Surfed there, and a bunch of kids came out to watch him. And when he came out of the water, he sort of vainly assumed that they would, sort of celebrate him for doing this. And instead, they all disappeared. They ran away. And he's like, where did everybody go? And then they all came back with their bodyboards because they had been doing this thing for ages. And but they had not, in their lifetimes, they had not seen anyone do it on his feet. So what they had been doing for ages was that, like I said, their fathers had these massive fishing canoes made from very light wood. And when the fishing canoe broke down, it just sat around. And so it was very common to hack it up and take the bottom of the hull and use it as a bodyboard. So all the kids had these 3-foot bodyboards. After Sam visited, they carved 8-foot boards, and they learned to stand on them. I have one because I traded my fiberglass board for one of them. And everybody was delighted. I was delighted. The kids were delighted to have the fiberglass board. I think they had a total of 10 fiberglass boards since Sam's arrival. Right? Every now and then they collect one. I've tried to ride this wooden board. While I was riding it, it was always at least 2 feet underwater. I mean, it got waterlogged, and it was really hard to ride. The guy, the one surfer that Sam focused on, but the one guy who really took to surfing, named Shum, who was just out of the military when I went there. He was a teenager when Sam met him. Could fucking charge on that wooden board. Amazing. And so could the other kids. I mean, they could really ride it, even though it didn't float like a like you and I would hope.
It's those exchanges are the beautiful nuggets of these surfing histories that you're talking about. That Sam, I talked to Sam a while back when I was writing my dissertation, and he was really helpful with some stories. All of you guys have really been in your own way helpful for me as I put together my research. So yeah, I'm very grateful for the scholarship out there alone. But those stories are beautiful stories, and there's many of those, like I said, in Central America, and so, but we'll get over back into Latin America shortly when I'm really interested to hear about your, experience in Cuba, which is a place I've been to, quite often. And so, but another place that, again, I've heard about people surfing, and I've heard about, I think you even mentioned it, Surfing for Peace, in your book, if I'm not mistaken. Again, another nonprofit on our website. You know, I've heard about nonprofits using surfing for peace building, and so I knew, and I meet a lot of Israelis around the world surfing, including in Nicaragua and other places. But I was just really curious to get your, again, a bit of a history of the place in terms of how surfing was introduced, and what it's like to be there and surf actually in Gaza.
Yeah, Israel and Gaza were fascinating because I arrived in Israel with a surfboard, right? And one of the border officials, when you come in, they say, "Well, what do you want to do in Israel? What are you here for?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to surf." And she said, "Well, Israel doesn't have waves. We don't have surfing here." And I remember taking a taxi into Tel Aviv right after that. I mean, immediately after that conversation, and seeing a giant O'Neill billboard over a tunnel in Tel Aviv. Like, what do you mean you have no surf culture here? You're just full of shit. So again, it contradicts the official line, right? And the surfing scenes, both in Tel Aviv and Gaza, have set up a friendship and a communication that completely undermines the official state of war. And in that sense, it's a peace project. And Arthur Rashkevan, who was running Surf for Peace when I was there, and maybe still does, said he doesn't see any other way. He said it's been an official state of war at the top between the leaders for longer than his own lifetime, and a lot of Israelis, just like a lot of Palestinians, are sick of it. So this kind of grassroots communication is in some ways more important because it's something that people can actually do. So.
Absolutely, and I think, I'm a huge advocate of sports. When I had a nonprofit for quite some time where we use soccer for community development projects, education, using it as the vehicle. And I was pleased to see this nonprofit, however long ago it was, that surfing was being used for this peace building. And as you said, both, the youth and many there in their own right are sick of it. And it's a beautiful thing to see, a nonprofit or surfing being used in this way. And so, yeah, it was nice to see, again, another sort of off the beaten path surf spot that you went to. And but so how were the waves? Did you get to surf?
Terrible. So the thing about trying to surf in Gaza, I don't recommend it as a surf trip, partly because there's so many other logistical things you have to think about it besides the surf conditions, right? Before you can get to Gaza, you have to deal with the Israeli authorities. You have to find a driver to meet you on the other side. You have to get reservations at the Al Dira Hotel or wherever, but the Al Dira Hotel is the one most Westerners go to in Gaza City. It is right on the beach. Beautiful old crumbling grand hotel, right? You cannot do all that and line up all your logistics with surf conditions. So by the time I finally made it to Gaza and got over there, the surf was flat. Nevertheless, I met the Gaza Surf Club, which was then an association of about 40 guys. But shortly after that, and I missed this story, shortly after that, they were starting to teach their sisters to surf. They would go out in full abaya, so they would they had to be young enough, first of all. Once they became women, they were not really allowed to swim anymore. But 12-year-olds could go out, 10-year-olds, and they would get taught to surf by these guys in the Gaza Surf Club. Unfortunately, I didn't see that, but I met these Gazans who all had different political affiliations, by the way. Not all of them were friendly to Hamas, which is the terrorist organization, quite frankly, that's in charge of the Gaza Strip. Some of them were Fatah-oriented and whatever, but they were all friends. And they were glad to I think I snuck in some wetsuits on behalf of the surfers in Tel Aviv, and they were glad to get those. They had between, among about 40 members, they had about 10 surfboards between them, among them, and those surfboards were hard to find because what does Hamas want with allowing surfboard manufacture? And that kind of thing is simply impossible in Gaza. So it was all about the donations from the surfers in Tel Aviv. And that was established only in 2007 with Dorian Paskowitz, who is the pioneer of surfing in Israel. As a young man, Paskowitz went to Israel in the 50s. And he was this sort of gung-ho young doctor who had also been a surfer in California. And once he became kind of patriotic about Israel, he went to Israel shortly after its founding, I think during the Suez Crisis, and he was so patriotic on behalf of Israel, you have to phrase it that way, that he tried to sign up to fight. And the guy said, "What do you mean you want to fight for Israel? Do you have an Israeli passport?" He said, "No, I have an American passport." He said, "You cannot fight for Israel just because you're an American Jew." And he sent him packing. And Paskowitz said, "I felt so bad, and I took my surfboard." Of course, he had traveled with a surfboard. He said he dragged it out onto the beach in Tel Aviv and he went surfing for the first time.
Wow, that's interesting. And again, I just, I when I think about how sports, by the way, that's an interesting story. He's trying to join, the cause, and they're like, "Well, you're an American Jew, so like you can't do this." But back to your point about women surfing and all of these people coming from different ideologies and places, surfing levels the playing field. Surfing, and again, I would say that about soccer too, and we could use probably a whole host of other sports, but that's the beautiful thing about sport when it's used beyond, I always say, like beyond the waves, like not just for exercise, but for advocacy, for peace building. And you witnessed it firsthand, and that's another thing that I really enjoyed about that specific chapter. And the other thing about women is you're seeing nonprofits around the world, including some friends in Nicaragua, that are using surfing as a way to empower young girls, young women. And so, again, what an incredible experience. And you go to Japan as well, and you go to Cuba.
Oh, let me continue the story in Israel.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So Paskowitz, who first of all sort of seeded surfing in Israel then in the 1950s, because all the lifeguards who saw him go out and stand up on a surfboard decided to start surfing, and they became the godfathers of surfing in Israel. I met their children and grandchildren in the water when I was there. But Paskowitz then in old age saw an article that showed two of the members of the Gaza Surf Club, future members, sharing one board, because there was only one board in the Gaza Strip, one fiberglass board. And he said, "You know what? We should go over there and give them some boards." So without any plan about how to do it, he showed up at the Erez crossing between Israel and the Gaza Strip with like a dozen surfboards. And he made a big show, because he called a bunch of media, and he made a big show of ducking under the gate, the traffic gate on the Erez crossing, with a couple of surfboards. And eventually those got moved over to Gaza as a donation. And that was a really radical thing to do. And that was the beginning of the Gaza Surf Club, because then all of a sudden they had a bunch of boards. So this man who was willing to fight for Israel, this man who's basically a Zionist, as far as Israel was concerned, was also quite willing to perform this gesture of peace towards the Palestinians. And that was important, and that was the beginning of surfing for peace. And he gave me an interesting quotation. He said, we can, both of us, the Israelis and the Palestinians, can be very passionate about what we think we need and what we deserve, but we can also be friends. It's not a contradiction to him.
Absolutely. No, and that's
an old-fashioned.
Yeah, but it's also, as you said, it's a very radical idea, but it's also a very beautiful and really feasible, in many ways. And seeing that, this vision being carried out, as as some might see it as insignificant, but that vision being carried out through surfing, really is, it's inspiring,
I,
to,
I think so too.
and so, yeah, so thanks, thanks for, kind of finishing that story for us. And I know you, like I said, I was, saying you were in Japan, and I want to go to Japan and hear a little bit about that. And then I'm really, like I said, you got to hang out in Cuba and surf, and a place that I've been to. And so I'm also curious about that. But um you talk about Japan. You again, like in these other places, you meet one of the, some of the first generation surfers, and you say that, I'm quoting you, the flow of info was intimidating. And I don't know, I guess you were talking about the history of surfing, or what did you mean by all that?
I think so.
What info?
I don't quite remember that line. I would have used the word information, by the way. I think
Oh
the
yeah, I probably shorthanded that. So you're
I seem
probably right.
I seem to remember thinking that in Tokyo. So Japanese people just in general have this capacity for an enormous amount of information generally. And when you found like something that was interesting in Tokyo, I mean, interesting to tourists or interesting as a historical marker, there would be a sign and then an explanation of it in several different languages. And the level of detail was sort of unprecedented. And that overload was just the main experience in Tokyo. You had ads and billboards and everything flashing from every direction, and buildings all over the place, and an enormous number of people on the street. And in that sense, it was overwhelming, and you felt that it was also a sort of mental overload. And I find that really fascinating. And in that sense, there's something typical about that. And the Japanese do have a way of absorbing other cultures because they get very curious about them and try to not just imitate them, but learn as much about them as they can. And that's what happened with surfing, because in the 60s, there was a new generation of Japanese kids growing up, and they knew exactly what had happened in the war, and it was a lot like Germany after the war. The kids didn't want anything to do with the parents because there was a fascist past and an imperial warmongering past. I mean, the war that Japan was involved in started earlier than World War II, right? They had an imperial expansionist war going on, and that's why they attacked Hawaii. Before that, they had already invaded spots in China, and Indonesia, I think, happened during the war. But they broke the back of European imperialism during World War II in that region because they wanted to be the new imperial masters of those places. They didn't arrive as liberators. So that history was not very, and then plus the nuclear bombs. That was all a nightmare that the country was trying to awake from, and the kids really wanted nothing to do with that authoritarian recent past. And so when surfing arrived as a culture, not just the idea that you could ride a wave, but also surf music, surf sounds is how they described it to me. All the kids on the coast of Japan were like, yeah, because nothing like that had been seen on Earth, at least as far as they were concerned, right? The whole idea of pop modern surf culture was brand new back then. And they took to it because it was a complete break with the past. Now, the typical story in Japan is that the kids on the coast would see a Marine surfing and want to do that. And I heard that over and over, and I'm sure it was true. There was bodyboarding in Japan from about 1914. They have their own board called an itago. So they knew about riding in the surf. They had something of a surf culture. But I met a guy who I think was probably the first surfer in Japan, who first saw, Taro Takahashi is a wonderful old guy, actually. And he said that he first saw surf pictures in a children's magazine in about 1959. And he said, I want to do that. And so first he set out to build his own surfboard, and that didn't work. And then finally he saw a surfboard that the son of a Marine had, like a fiberglass board from the US. And he inspected that, and then he could build a much better prototype. And he seems to have been the first Japanese guy to surf, um, even before the other kids who, maybe got their hands on a board and saw these Marines off the coast. So, and he had the idea before he saw a Marine, because he had seen a picture in a magazine. So that's a little bit parallel with Uwe Drath in Germany. The picture.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just it's, this is why, I kind of going back to the title of your book, how surfing spread from Hawaii and California to the rest of the world with some unexpected results.
Right.
It just this,
Yeah, right.
because a lot of times, like we were talking about earlier, the diffusion and proliferation of surfing really was aided by the spread of American empire. But all of these other stories, like you said, like Germany, Japan, these individuals are seeing things in, as you said, a children's magazine or an encyclopedia and saying, I want to do that. I want to walk on water. I want to stand on the water. And so, it's fascinating. And now we just, recently, the Olympics included surfing. And
Yeah.
I believe the first place it was in Japan.
Absolutely. It was actually in that coast that I visited. So right in the neighborhood where I met Taro Takahashi, and also stayed in kind of a surf lodge run by a Brit, was that local beach is where they had the Olympic contest. And I wanted to go back to cover it for a magazine, but I couldn't find a magazine that was willing to pay for that. The 2020 and 2021 were bad years for that because of COVID. Otherwise, I would have gone there as a surf correspondent. But I got some interest, but it was really hard to find someone willing to send me there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it made travel a bit of a challenge. So, and when I saw, okay, surfing's being introduced in the Olympics, I'm like, right on, like it's, I'm biased because I love surfing, but I know you might not have been there then, but I can imagine now, based on the history you're telling me, that the folks that lived in that part of Japan where they were hosting it, there had to have been a sense of pride, right? Like,
I think so.
like this is our sport too. This isn't just Californians and Hawaiians and and some of the more Australians or whatever. But yeah, so I mean, I would have never known that had you not sort of informed me.
Yeah, and I mean, in the meantime, of course, Japan has a terrific relationship with Hawaii. Lots of Japanese people like to go vacation there, and of course, lots of Japanese people grow up there. It's part of the culture in Hawaii.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot more familiarity now with surfing in Japan, and they feel they have that direct relationship. It's not processed through the United States necessarily.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they have a legitimate reason to have that, opinion.
Yeah, for sure.
And
Now, one interesting thing I found in Japan was a surfboard either said the word Duke on it or was definitely from Duke, a Hanamaku, a redwood board, so possibly built from California wood. But anyway, the board was probably from about 1920, and it found its way to Japan as a gift in 1928, and it became a bench in the yard of a very nice hotel. And the owner of the hotel, the sort of young heir to the hotel, he gave me the history, but I said, did anyone ride the board back in the 20s? He said, maybe some guests.
I mean, Duke seemed to be everywhere. So, maybe it could have been,
I don't know if Duke personally went to Japan, but that's an earlier time when somebody very well might have surfed in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely.
To a certain.
No, it's fascinating. I went to the surfing Heritage and Cultural Center. You're probably familiar with it in San Clemente.
In San Clemente, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they have, I went there because I was doing, my research for my dissertation, and they have. I found it funny that I was doing quote unquote archival research by digging through surfing magazines, but that's what we do. But they had all these boards from Duke, and I just it was really one of the first times I'd been in a room with all of those old boards together. So I can, and but I can see how that could be converted into a bench too, oddly enough. But yeah, so I want to sort of bring this book to a close, talking a little bit about your experience in Cuba. And
Yeah.
that one for me, because Cuba is one of the areas that, I know as a historian really well. I really, what I liked about it was you gave a bit of a history there too, and I'm not saying you didn't do that in the other ones, because you certainly did, but as I was reading it, I was like, yeah, okay, he's really weaving some history into this. And how do you talk about Cuba and not do that? But as far as surfing and just your experience in Cuba, what was it like for the listeners who are like, there's waves in Cuba?
Yeah, no, it was really wonderful. I mean, there's a surf club in Cuba, just like there was a surf club in Gaza. And the conditions were similar too, because the Cuban economy doesn't allow people to just, set up a shaping shop. The planned economy doesn't even make room for the materials you would need for a shaping shop. So the first problem that Cuban kids had when they first learned that there was such a thing as surfing, modern surfing, they had to build their own boards. And those, just like the attempts in Japan and the attempts in Gaza, which there were some before the events we mentioned in Gaza. Those first boards were pieces of crap. And so finally, the local kids who wanted to go out and surf realized that they needed boating materials. They looked at a piece of a surfboard, maybe a broken surfboard that a tourist had brought from Europe. And then they learned to raid old fridges and boating shops, harbors, for fiberglass as well as foam. And I stayed with a guy named Eduardo Valdez, who ran the Havana Surf Club. And in his basement or his garage, he basically had a shaping shop, and he was a scavenger. He took pieces of things that people brought him from abroad, including skegs and foam, and he repaired boards, and he made new ones. And that's how those guys surfed. Otherwise, they did have a bit of an underground connection, from Florida. Cubans know how to get stuff on the black market, and they could get leashes and things like that from Florida. But not, a surfboard is a little big to smuggle. So that's how they had to make do. And I think surfing started as a direct result of two movies. One of them was Point Break, which looked anti-capitalist enough to the Fidel regime at the time that they put it on TV. And all the kids were like, yeah.
Wow,
And
I
so
didn't.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other movie was Maneuver Radical from Brazil.
Okay. Okay.
Those two films in about 1990 had a huge influence on the Cuban youth. And we have to realize that Cuba is only shut off from America. It's not shut off from the rest of the world. And in the 90s, there were lots of tourists coming from Europe with surfboards because
Absolutely, yeah.
Europe. And so they would see these tourists, and they had been told by the government that Cuba was the best thing on earth and was the most advanced society, and they see rich Europeans coming with surfboards, and they see them riding in the waves, and the first thing those Cuban kids did was take their desks from school, their desktops, and took them out to ride on their bellies, and then they learned to stand from there. So that's a reversal, by the way, of what happened in Hawaii. When the missionaries went to Hawaii, they squelched surfing. They said, okay, no, we can't do this anymore. And they took surfboards and they turned them into writing desks.
Yeah, it's, the whole Cuba, there's first of all, before I forget, I want to mention there was a really good documentary a friend sent to me a little while back, Havana Libre, which was about, have you seen it?
If I saw it, it was a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah. It was, so it's about, essentially like more or less what you were talking about, this history of surfing there, and how, obviously building a craft that can float on water, was problematic because of just, people, at the time wanting to flee Cuba, and so
Right.
they struggled to make it, for the government to acknowledge it as a sport.
Right. That's
And
right.
so, really great documentary, and kind of falls in line with a lot of the things you're talking about. Did you, we've been talking about surfing there, but did you surf there? Because I'm pretty sure I know Havana. I've been
Mhm.
to, traveled the whole country, and there's a couple places in the Far East, some
Yeah.
river mouths that I think show
Yeah.
potential. But did you surf anywhere when you were there?
Yeah, I surfed with the Havana Surf Club around Havana at those spots, and actually the waves were pretty good. But those Havana spots lie in the shadow of the Indies, so those all those islands block a lot of really good swells from the Atlantic. But Cuba Oriental absolutely gets better waves, I think. I wanted to go out there, but time ran short, and the best way to get out there was a plane. And I talked to Eduardo about it, and I said, well, can I get there and back in time? He said, well, maybe, but the plane might break down. Um, and I said something about taking a plane out and then another plane back. He said, no, it's the same plane. So he said, yeah, if you're worried about making your main flight out of Cuba, then don't take the flight over into the east. And that was a great. I was very sorry to miss that, and I want to go back actually and surf in the east.
Yeah, when I went to Eastern Cuba, I went by bus. I kind of just traveled, made my
Yeah,
way across. I wasn't going to surf. I was just curious to, explore the whole country, get, a bit of a deeper under. I'd been studying it for a while, but as you very well know, there's a world of difference between reading and studying and experiencing. And when
exactly.
you compare those, it's a beautiful thing, obviously. But I was like, I'm going to Cuba. I'm going to cruise around and figure it out. But yeah, as I was on the east side, specifically the Jumuri River, I was like, this place has got surf potential for sure. And
It
so
isn't there footage of waves over in the east in the film you mentioned, or is it?
they might be. It very well, there very well may be.
I saw that footage somewhere. I mean, it looks terrific. So
And you might be right, because I think when I saw it, I was like, I knew that place had good waves. And so yeah, it's definitely got some potential. But yeah, and I have, being that I'm here in Florida, it's really easy to go to Cuba. And I've
is it
really been
directly?
meaning, what were you saying?
You have direct flights now?
Yeah, we've had, there's been direct flights for a while, but major US airlines do direct flights. We, here in Tampa, Florida, we had Southwest Airlines going direct.
Yeah.
But and
I
so
flew from New
I've had a number of friends ask about it, like, hey, how are the waves in Cuba? I'm like, well, I mean, we'd be better off going to a more consistent place, but going to Cuba to surf would be, and connecting with the surf club there, because I have a buddy who's part of that as well, would be, I think it'd be an awesome trip, and particularly for friends who've never been to Cuba, to just experience it. But
Cuba
yeah,
itself.
so Michael, I first of all love the book, recommend the book. But
Thank you.
before we go, I would like to, you've written another book more recently about a much
Pirates.
more harrowing experience, let's say. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that with for the listeners, maybe as a, I don't know, a teaser? So again, another book I'd recommend for sure. But would you mind just sharing about that?
Yeah, that obviously sort of consumed my life after a while. But I was still based in Berlin when Sweetness and Blood came out, and at the time, maybe a year later, I was covering a trial of 10 Somali pirates in Hamburg for Spiegel, and I covered it for a year. Um, and then I decided to go to Somalia because I wanted background on the story. I thought it might make a good book, and I found not just a more experienced journalist who could guide me there, but also a Somali elder in Berlin who had brought European journalists down there and back safely. So Ashwin was an Indian-born documentary maker in Germany. Ashwin and I decided to go down there with him. and I got kidnapped. So I was held hostage for 2 years and 8 months, and my book about it, The Desert and the Sea, is probably my most famous book. Unfortunately, so it's about the most miserable time of my life, but I'm just happy to be alive at this point. A trial of 2 pirates in that case just ended in New York in February. So 2 pirates have been found guilty. When they're sentenced in the fall, I will write about that too.
Yeah, it's what I mean, I can't even imagine that experience. That is certainly for another podcast.
Yeah.
I obviously I became familiar with your surf work, surf history work. But as I was, reading and learning more about what you were up to, I read about that and I was like, wow, what a I don't even know if harrowing experience is the right word. Again, for those of you who are listening, this is the book Desert and the Sea, 977 days captive on the Somali Pirate Coast. So, that's not on the surfinghistorian.com because it's not a surf book, but Michael, I want to recommend that book as well. It has been an absolute pleasure. I was looking forward to having you on, and just really grateful we could walk through this surfing book. And of course, share your experience in Somalia. But, with that, I want to go ahead and give you the last word.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you, Jason. I think it's interesting. Maybe this is a departure from what we were saying, but I think it's interesting that we keep learning, just like Kevin Dawson brought to light, about more and more cultures around the world that obviously did some kind of surfing. They had some kind of surf culture, but and it's an important point that all those discoveries make, that white people did not bring surfing to the rest of the world. These cultures have existed probably for hundreds of years, if not thousands. And so I hope that people don't get that from my book just because I focus on the spread of modern surfing. But it's also really important to note that surfing developed to a fine pitch in Hawaii in a way that's unique in the world. You don't want to take that away from the Hawaiians. And also, you don't want to take away that question about why, because the going theory is that it was a Tahitian society that settled Hawaii. They paddled over on canoes, right, navigating by stars. And if those were Tahitians that settled Hawaii, why didn't they learn to surf in Tahiti, right? There's something special about that place. And that's an open question that I don't think surf research has really answered. Why did it develop to such a fine pitch, to something that was done for fun and for contests in Hawaii only, as far as we know? I hope we learn more, and I hope that theory gets upended. But so far, it's an actual mystery at the heart of the history of surfing that I think is really important to consider and to respect.
If you enjoyed my conversation with Michael about his research on surf travel, I'd like to invite you to check out my next episode, where I'll be joined by ethnomusicologist and UC Santa Barbara professor Dr. Tim Cooley. Tim and I will be chatting about his book, Surfing About Music. Not only is this book an enjoyable read, it's the first major examination of the interrelationships between music and surfing. If exploring the different ways that surfers combine surfing with making and listening to music gets you stoked, then this will certainly be an episode you won't want to miss. We also want to take a moment to thank Face Stuff again for sponsoring this episode. Don't forget to check them out at face-stuff.com. And while you're there, use promo code STOKED15 for 15% off your purchase. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Surfing Historian. If you're stoked on these conversations, be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. And don't forget to check out our killer merch at surfinghistorian.com. Proceeds go to help keep this amazing podcast going strong. Until next time, stay stoked.